we want to build single-page applications, SPAs is all the cool kids call them, with Angular 2. I mean, that's sort of what Angular 2 is all about. Now, one of the keys to an SPA is to allow somebody to get back to wherever it was that they happen to be on the page by providing some additional information inside of the URL, or what would be called in say, MVC, setting up a route. So can I do routes and take over the URL in Angular?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a look at that. I have here an example. I think the best way to explain this is with an example. Of course, when we talk about routes, we talk about how can one part of our page change without the rest of the page changing, without our URL perhaps changing, or maybe the URL does change, but again, not the entire page changes. So what we have here is the provider, the routes provider, right? And again, providers are, in this case, libraries is what we're importing. And so what we have on the very top here is a new import we haven't seen yet. We're importing the different parts that we need for specifically routing. The component is the same we've seen before. There's a selector. There is room to add directives and room to add providers. There is a template with all the HTML. And there is an added piece there, which is the route config. So we want to switch between different parts of our application. If you see here, our template has a nav section. We have two different anchor tags. They have their own router link values of nodes and tasks. And so this is part, of course, of the pattern we use for Angular to do this. Each component that has this navigation piece that it can show different partials does need the directives for the router directives and the router providers. And we need to define the route config in the very bottom there. So the idea is that you would click on one of those two A tags, and that would trigger that particular router link. And then that would look into the route config in the bottom there and match up the name. So if we clicked on notes, it will match up the capital notes name there to the first route config object there in our array in the bottom. And it defines the path that it's going to give us in the URL. The name is what kind of triggers that. And then it also defines what component is going to load. And where it loads is right under that nav bar in the router outlet. So the router outlet is essentially a directive, essentially, right? And within that router outlet is where we load the notes component in this case. And then we have, of course, use as default to define which one of these paths do we want to define as default. So the idea, again, behind these providers, beyond the service providers, is libraries. This one particularly allowing us to have different sections of our page change. And we can actually do more of this, and we can even nest routes to have partials of page load and have those have links that load partials of those pages. So that's kind of what it allows you to do. So we'll also be able to see this kind of as a small demonstration here in a minute. So you can kind of see how it acts when you actually code it.
Okay, so then let's actually see our routes in action.
Sounds good.